I'm George Shilling. I'm a record producer and recording engineer, and I got into the business pretty much straight out of school. When I was a child growing up, I play the cello, and I grew up in a very musical family. My father was an opera singer, and he used to practice using an old reel-to-reel tape machine. So when he upgraded to cassette, I got to play with his tape machine, and I got fascinated by playing at different speeds and turning it upside down and getting things to play backwards, and just experimenting with that a bit. So I was kind of interested in the recording side of things, and I used to go to the library and get books out on tape recording and find out about it like that. But I was taking the cello playing pretty seriously as well. So when I left school, I went to the Royal College of Music on a performers course. But my heart wasn't in it, and I was commuting a huge distance each day. So I saw an advert in the paper for sound operators for the BBC. I thought, that sounds quite exciting. So I wrote to the BBC and got an interview there, but they were even more stuffy than the Royal College of Music, so that really wasn't for me. But I then started writing to commercial recording studios and eventually landed a job at Livingston Studios in North London, which is still going. And I turned up for the interview at 10 o'clock in the morning, and the Sisters of Mercy, a goth band, all wearing black leather and shades and big hats, were sitting there, and they'd been there all night, and I just thought that was the coolest thing in the world. So the idea of staying up all night and doing recording sessions. So that was where I started, knowing nothing about how anything really worked apart from my dad's reel-to-reel machine. And I made tea and fetched people's McDonald's and did all the sort of menial tasks that you do in studios, or that you used to be able to do if you could get that sort of job. And just worked my way up really, and I got quite lucky. I engineered some records that were successful. I worked with Cold Cut, who were the sort of thrusting DJ team at the time, and they produced The Only Way Is Up by Yaz, which was #1 for 5 weeks. And then I kind of, on the same label, the Soup Dragons were signed to the same label as Yaz, which was much more my cup of tea, guitar, indie rock sort of stuff. So I produced their album and worked on their hit. I produced their hit, I'm Free. And then I went freelance and started visiting other studios all around London and turning up, not knowing what all the knobs did, but you kind of work it out. And gradually sort of got to work abroad a bit as well, went off to Denmark and all sorts of other countries around Europe, and I eventually went to Japan a few times, and I was working in all the good studios in London, Townhouse, Olympic, which are all closed now, pretty much. So I underwent quite a sea change it was about 7 years ago now. I built my own studio at home, partly sort of through necessity, because people didn't have the budgets to send me to Townhouse and Olympic and wherever else. So I sort of took the plunge and invested some money into building myself a fairly proper studio at home with air conditioning and Pro Tools HD, little baby grand piano in the corner which I already owned, and lots of gear, and I've obviously continued acquiring gear since then. So most of my work now is done at home with people coming to me, and I also do stuff like online mixing and mastering where people send me things to fiddle about with and mess around with and email it back to them effectively. I'm lucky enough to have a reasonable broadband connection, although I sort of live out in the sticks. So it's quite a mixture of stuff that I do now. And since I built the studio, I've got back more and more into actually playing instruments again. And before I built the studio, I joined a local amateur orchestra. I picked up my cello again and started playing. And it's really come in useful. So I've sort of diversified into doing that a bit. And writing music for TV. Now I've got my own space, I can kind of get things come in via email and do briefs that come in for adverts or whatever. And I love the fact that you've got all the modern technology, gives you the chance to program beats or instruments or and fix all my mistakes, because I'm still not the greatest musician in the world with my long lapse between dropping out of music college and building my studio. So but wonderfully you've got all the technology to sort of actually be a lot more creative now and do that kind of stuff. So it's a big mixture of things that I do, and I've also for the last however many years, probably getting on for 20 years, been writing for magazines as well, which is another great diversification and a nice little thing to keep doing, because I get sent bits of gear for the studio to try out. So I've tried lots of bits of gear I wouldn't have otherwise ever seen or heard, and bits of software. So I kind of get to keep up with what's going on as well. And I even go and interview other producers and find out all their secrets. So you might see some of those online. There's a website, recordproduction.com, where some of my interviews are, as well as appearing in Resolution magazine. So I've got a diverse range of things that I do nowadays, and I'm busier than ever, which is fantastic. When I got into the business, I got a job and made the tea and served a very sort of old-fashioned style apprenticeship. And that opportunity is less and less common these days. And also the attitudes of studio managers and employers has changed, because in those days they didn't want you to have learnt anything at a college or on a course, because they wanted to train you there in their own methods. So it's all completely changed from when I got a job in the business. Now you really want to study as hard as you can, I think, and learn and take up any opportunities you get to learn before you try and, if you're even going to try and get a job in a commercial studio, because there's very few of those about really. And yes, you can go and buy a copy of Pro Tools or whatever on your computer and read the manual and learn how the theoretical side of that sort of side of it works. But there's so much else to learn. And I think finding a good course where you can mix with other people and get an opportunity to record people is invaluable these days. And for any job opportunity in sound and anything related, you're expected to have a qualification or at least some experience before you turn up knocking at the door. They don't want to train you, so it's good to acquire as much knowledge as possible. And I'd also say, to sort of diversify as much as possible and learn other related areas. Your personality is important. If you might have to manage the financial side of a project. There's all sorts of things to think about. You might want to, if you're going to produce, you need to know when things are in tune and in time. So any experience you can get and any ways of learning are valuable, and you learn by doing stuff in anger. So if you get the opportunity to be on a course where there's a recording studio, make use of it and as much as you possibly can, and get in there and do some recording and mixing. Find out how it works. I've never been to Berlin before, and I've absolutely loved being here, even though it's been a very brief couple of days. I sort of jumped off the delayed aeroplane and immediately marched around to the Brandenburg Gate and saw all the tourist things that were within walking distance of my hotel. And it's fantastic. I love it. It's great. It's a really nice place. And there's so much of all the sort of relatively recent history, which is fascinating. I was always fascinated at school in the sort of 50s and 60s, because they never really taught you much about that. It was kind of the textbook stopped at the end of the Second World War when I was at school. So it's great to sort of see all this sort of kind of stuff. And the Funkhaus is just amazing. It smells like my parents' attic and all that sort of 1950s bits of wood, because they had their attic conversion done in the 50s or 60s. So, it's all that kind of nice old sort of light. I don't know what sort of wood it is, but it's got a lovely smell to it. But they're just such great spaces, and obviously, they were described as sort of world-class recording facilities. It's just fascinating to see and imagine what went on in a place like this. All the sort of amazing radio stations. Because when I was growing up, I used to go to jumble sales and buy valve radios and tune into distant European radio stations. So I've probably, when I was about 10 years old or 12 years old, I probably heard something that was done here, which is amazing to think, There's probably people here soaring away in an orchestra or, in a voiceover studio talking in German. I probably tripped over it on my way across the dial. And it's a beautiful place. I love it. It's been absolutely fantastic to see. And I'm sort of fascinated by, as I say, that period of history and musical instruments from that time and all those sort of slightly old things that have a bit of a German technical aspect to them, and it's really an interesting thing for me to have been here, and I'm had a wonderful time. There's been a major change in the way you do things in terms of recording music while I've been doing it. Unlike other industries where things sort of gradually get better and the technology improves as you make, I don't know, cars or something, they make better tyres and better engines, and they might invent a few little bits to bolt onto the engine, the turbo and the supercharger and all that. In music recording, it's kind of, tape and analog recording and mixing desks were kind of getting better and better and better, and then suddenly, bonk, along came digital. And we all had to sort of learn a whole new skill set. And I actually sort of put it off for a while in terms of recording. Well, I mean, I recorded digitally using dash machines and things like that in studios, which was still a thing going around on a tape recorder, and we were using analog desks. And then I had to learn how to use the Neve Capricorn digital desk, which I sort of got my head around pretty quickly, but I didn't really like it an awful lot. Not from a sonic point of view, just from an operational point of view. But it was obviously, fledgling technology, and it's obviously all improved a lot since that was invented. And so, I first got a computer at home only in about sort of 2001, I suppose it was, for doing audio, which was quite late for, a lot of my contemporaries who had already been doing it for a while. But once you start doing it, there's no going back. You know, the ease of editing and keeping takes and all that sort of stuff is just amazing, and it's like a dream come true in many respects. All those things that you wanted to do when you had tape and the limitations of that, and time-consuming edits, and you know, I quite enjoyed getting the razor blade out and slashing up bits of tape, and it was a bit more manly in those days. You know, you press record and you had to edit at the right time, and if you didn't, that was it was gone, you know. So, you know, you had to be brave, and I'm glad I went through that stage of things, because I'm still pretty good at hitting record in the right place as and when I need to. You know, I did a horn section the other week and we were doing things in bits, and probably a younger, less sort of reckless engineer might have just put everything on separate tracks and ended up with 1 million tracks in Pro Tools, but I was just going for it and punching it in, and you can always scroll it back a bit anyway in Pro Tools, can't you, and cheat. So I'm glad I went through that phase, and I'm glad I'm here now doing the digital thing, because it's improved immensely, and you know, funnily enough, a lot of my favourite digital things are emulations of analogue things, of course, and I guess part of that is the nostalgia and the familiarity. You know, all the UAD plugins, I love all those 1176s they brought out and all that sort of stuff, because you kind of feel like you're doing it properly then, don't you? You know, even if it just looks like it is, it doesn't matter what it sounds like, it just kind of looks like you're doing it properly. But it does sound really good now. It has actually, you know, it does sound a lot better, and I'm pretty happy to do stuff in the box and pretty confident that it's pretty good sounding. You know, I think in terms of the overall quality of things, I've no complaints really, and I'm very happy to just work that way. I think the analog digital debate will go on forever, I'm sure, but and I love analog outboard when I'm recording, but people expect you to be able to just recall mixes like that these days, and they won't, you know, finance the hours you might spend setting up all the gear again to get a mix back to where it was if you had everything plugged in. So you've either just got to brave it and go for it, and I've done a bit of that, you know, in recent years, but in the main it's working inside the digital domain once you've recorded it. Things like I did the sound at V Festival for Channel 4 and Virgin Radio a few times on one of the stages there, and you know, they'd broadcast the first song as the band came out on stage and played their first song before you'd even worked out what fader was which, you know. So I think you know, Girls Aloud coming on with 5 vocal mics, 5 tracks coming off the tape machine, off the computer, and some pre-recorded backing vocals, and a few things like that going. So you've got about 15 channels of just vocals before you know where to begin. So trying to sort of balance those and get them right, and you know, and of course that's the one they show on the telly. So that's pretty scary, stuff like that. And doing string sections in the studio, I guess, if you've got 12 players who are all getting paid proper rates and you're at Air Studios or something. But I guess it doesn't happen so much these days. You know, I'm in my comfort zone in my own home. I mean, I had some horn players in the other day, and you've got to make sure you're set up and ready for them. And that's where your training and your experience of working in big studios comes to the fore, really, because all that experience means that you know to sort of set rough levels before they even turn up, and they're still working on a strict 3-hour MU session, so you've got to be ready for them, and you've got to make sure their headphones are going to work, and you've got to listen to what they're saying, and you know, make sure they're happy and comfortable, really. So that's the scary side of things, really. In terms of exciting, it's a funny one, that, because you get excited if it's somebody famous, I suppose, and somebody you know. You know, I had Slade come to my studio. That was pretty exciting, because it's like I bought a Slade record when I was about 10 years old, so or probably, yeah, something like that. And having Dave Hill turn up in your studio, great, you know, and he still plays the guitar like he's on top of the pops, and Don hits the drums incredibly hard. So that's exciting when you get somebody, because it's always a potential for a complete disaster when it's somebody who's famous and there's all that expectation. And you know, you don't always want to meet your heroes necessarily, especially when they're all in their 60s. So and you remember them when they were in their 20s or 30s, you know. But that's the sort of thing. But in terms of studio sessions, exciting sessions happen sometimes when it's, you know, you've never even met them before, and they turn up and they set up and they're all playing together, and you go, oh, this is really exciting, because it's making a great noise, and you're always looking for the next thing, you know. It's not necessarily exciting to be working with the old gits. It's sometimes more exciting to be working with the as yet undiscovered people, or even a really calm situation where it's just collaborating with an artist, and I'm doing some of the instruments and we're coming up with noises and inventing sounds and just being experimental. That's exciting too. So I think variety is the spice of life, and you know, all the diverse things that I do keep it all exciting, really. So I get excited just sitting in my studio and the night before a session looking at all my gear thinking, yeah, this is going to be great fun.